In the thick jungles of Ben Tri Province, South Vietnam, on January 17, 1960, an event unfolded that shook the foundations of modern warfare and left the world's strongest military force scrambling for answers. From the villages of the Mekong Delta, 5,000 women emerged like a living nightmare, armed not with real weapons, but bamboo sticks carved to resemble rifles. They surrounded fortified military outposts, and what happened next defied logic. Soldiers inside, trained by American advisors and equipped with millions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry, panicked. They abandoned their posts, their guns, and even their grip on reality. What they had faced was not supernatural. It was something far more unsettling. It marked the birth of a psychological warfare campaign, so advanced, so rooted in primal terror and cultural manipulation, that more than 60 years later, files about it remain locked away in Pentagon archives, considered too dangerous for public release. The mastermind behind this chilling victory would become known to American intelligence as the most dangerous figure in Southeast Asia. A woman so feared that combat veterans refused to say her name out loud. Yet her story is almost invisible in Western history, deliberately buried because some weapons are too horrifying to admit exist. Before diving into the legacy of Nguyen Thi Dinh and the psychological nightmares she unleashed on thousands of American soldiers. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of military history, those governments would rather erase, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Tap the notification bell and tell us in the comments where in America you're listening from. We love seeing where our community of dark history seekers is tuning in. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you've been told about the Vietnam War, and it may explain why some veterans still wake up screaming from memories that feel more like hauntings than dreams. The Mekong Delta in 1960 was a treacherous maze of waterways, rice fields, and jungles so dense it seemed designed to swallow armies whole. Ben Tri, nicknamed the Land of Coconut, stretched across this unforgiving landscape, home to 800,000 people, caught between forces that would rip their lives apart. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, and the rot of vegetation mixed with something harder to place the sharp tang of fear, a presence that had lingered since the French colonial era. This was a place where visibility rarely reached 30 feet, where the jungle seemed alive, hostile, and where the line between human civilization and raw wilderness dissolved into nothing. Into this world stepped Nguyen Thi Dinh, born March 15, 1920, the youngest daughter of a poor family in Luang Hoa Commune, Guyong Tram district. Her childhood unfolded under the harsh shadow of French rule, a system where public executions became spectacles and whole villages vanished overnight for the crime of sympathy toward the wrong side. The French didn't just rely on brute force, they wielded terror like an art form. Fear wasn't just a weapon, it was the very air people breathed. Dinh grew up watching acts of cruelty most couldn't endure. At just 7, she was forced to witness French soldiers dismember a suspected revolutionary, while the entire village was made to watch. His screams echoed across the rice fields for hours. But what left the deepest mark on her was not the violence itself, but the cold precision of the French commander who orchestrated it. She noticed how he observed the villagers more than the victim, tracking who looked away, who broke down, who stood paralyzed. It was her first lesson in the mechanics of psychological warfare. By the age of 16, she had seen enough brutality to understand that humans under the right pressure were capable of horrors beyond imagination. But unlike those who were broken by it, Dinh absorbed it like a lesson, studying it as if it were a science. She recognized the patterns of fear, how trauma spread through communities like a sickness, how certain images and sounds could bypass reason and strike straight into instinct. This was the foundation on which she would build a new kind of war. Her transformation from farm girl to revolutionary did not begin with ideology or politics, but with a personal tragedy so profound it reshaped her into something history had never seen before. In October of 1938, she married Nguyen Van Bish, a rising member of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, whose charisma and passion for independence inspired all who knew him. For a brief moment, life offered her happiness and the promise of a future. But in October 1939, when Dinh was 9 months pregnant, French colonial police descended on their home in a pre-dawn raid. From a hidden compartment, she watched in silence as they beat her husband nearly to death, his blood soaking into the floorboards of the house they had built together. 3 days after giving birth to their son, Nguyen, she was permitted one prison visit. It lasted 15 minutes. Through bruises and swelling, her husband whispered words that became her creed. They believe they understand fear because they can create it. But they do not know that fear properly cultivated can be turned back against them like a mirror. 6 months later, word arrived that he had died inside Con Dao prison. His body was never returned. The French refused to give an explanation, but whispers spread across the villages about the prison's underground tiger cages. Concrete pits, so small a man could only crouch, sealed with iron bars, so guards could urinate on the prisoners below. Men were fed rice laced with sand until their teeth crumbled, given salt water that drove them delirious fish sauce crawling with maggots. Some prisoners gnawed at their own flesh. Others slipped into a silence so absolute that no amount of torture could bring them back. These horrors became the blueprint for some of Dinh's most infamous psychological tactics years later. In June 1940, when her son was just 8 months old, she herself was arrested. The French orchestrated it for maximum cruelty. They waited until she was breastfeeding, then ripped the infant from her arms as she was dragged away. His screams followed her, searing themselves into her memory, a sound she later claimed never stopped echoing in her mind. Dinh spent 3 years in Baria prison, and it was there that her evolution truly began. She studied not just the cruelty inflicted on her, but the precise ways it shattered those around her. She learned how prolonged sensory deprivation dismantles the mind in stages, how isolation could make people question their own memories, and how fear spreads through communities like an infection following patterns as predictable as any disease. Baria was not just a prison for her, it was a laboratory. She observed how different prisoners broke under different pressures, cataloging each collapse as though she were collecting data. By the time she emerged, she was no longer simply a victim of colonial brutality. She was becoming the architect of a new kind of warfare, one where terror itself was the weapon. Some prisoners could take a beating and still keep their minds, but collapse when they heard a tape of their child crying. Others endured whips and blunt force, yet snapped into madness in absolute silence. And Dinh cataloged every weakness like a scientist mapping a virus, building psychological profiles she would later weaponize. Released in 1943, gaunt and branded with what French doctors called hysteria, but which was really severe PTSD, she returned to a South Vietnam reshaped by Japanese occupation and rising resistance, and threw herself into organizing women across Binh Tre with a focus no one else had: fear as a precise instrument. She had watched the French turn terror into theater, seen how a rumor or the promise of violence could erode morale faster than any firefight. And she learned that under the right triggers, the human mind obeys predictable patterns. By 1945, she had remarried a comrade, Nguyen Thi Dinh, who shared her goals, but not always her cold calculations, and she began drafting the ideas she called the doctrine of imposed madness. The theory that you could make an enemy doubt reality itself by controlling what they heard, saw, and expected. In 1946, she traveled north as part of a delegation to meet Ho Chi Minh, who reportedly told her, "This woman understands that the mind is both the ultimate weapon and the ultimate target, and he cleared her to develop her methods independently. For years, Den built an intelligence network of barbers, prostitutes, laundry women, and fruit-selling kids to learn the private fears of every man in every outpost, learning who dreamed of drowning, who heard ghosts of fathers who feared hereditary madness, and she placed those fears like tripwires. The morning of January 17th, 1960 started with an eerie stillness that seasoned soldiers would later call the calm before psychological hell. And at 3:00 a.m., the first phase of Operation Mind Spider began a campaign planned not to kill, but to turn training weapons and discipline against the soldiers by exploiting the most private, predictable parts of their minds. The night did not sound like the jungle should. Instead of crickets and frogs, there was children's laughter played backward and slowed to a pitch that clawed at the brainstem, stirring an instinctive dread no training could suppress. Then came the smell rotting lotus blossoms mixed with funeral incense riding smoke that moved unnaturally against the wind. Private Tran Van, posted at the Puak Heap outpost later, filed a trembling report about what he saw. Figures came out of the mist, but their bodies moved wrong. Some crawled backward on all fours, others walked on their hands, joints bending in ways no human body should allow. Their faces were painted ghostly white like funeral masks, but their eyes were pools of black, as if ink had been poured into them. They were women, yet they didn't move. Like women didn't move like people at all. They moved like creatures trying to imitate humanity and failing. Then hundreds emerged at once from every direction, with movements so synchronized it should have required radios or training drills. In the fog, their silhouettes carried rifles, but something about the shapes was off the angles. Warped, the lines bent as though the weapons themselves disobeyed physics. Instead of opening fire, the women unleashed sound. They spoke in overlapping fragments, their voices layering into a wall of noise where words lost meaning, but the emotion crushed down on the men inside. They used local dialects, but shifted the tones just enough to make familiar words alien threatening. Then the voices turned intimate. They spoke the soldiers' childhood nicknames, whispered their mothers' names, described private scars and birthmarks, secrets no enemy could possibly know. Lieutenant Nguyen Kalpat tried to rally his men, shouting for them to prepare to fire. But the women's response unraveled discipline. They began mirroring every motion the soldiers made, only in reverse. When a soldier raised his rifle, his counterpart lowered hers in perfect symmetry. When he stepped forward, she stepped back. The effect was like watching reality fracture into a broken reflection. Terror spiked when the women produced photographs, hundreds of them, and hurled them toward the defenses. Each image was tailored with precision. Some soldiers saw their own funerals staged and doctored, but eerily real. Others saw their families back home with subtle distortions, a child with too many fingers, a wife with an impossible smile, a mother whose eyes were as black as the attackers. Many of the photographs were stamped with dates still in the future. Then came what survivors later called the revelation phase. The women began speaking again, this time revealing impossibilities. They named soldiers one by one and recited dreams they had experienced just the night before. They described private conversations, whispered in barracks or letters written, but never mailed. To the men inside the outposts, it felt as though the attackers had entered not just the battlefield, but their innermost minds, dragging out the things they had never dared to share with another soul. One woman stood at the outpost and recited a prayer. Private Nguyen Van Duke had whispered alone every night since childhood, a prayer taught by his grandmother and never spoken aloud to anyone else. And at 4:17 a.m., The firecrackers began chosen for their numerological meaning of death and change, and altered to mimic the acoustic signatures of M16s, AK-47s, and grenades, while their smoke carried hallucinogenic compounds that blurred the edges of vision. The result was sensory chaos that made it impossible to tell where attacks were coming from, or whether real weapons were even present. In the mist, a woman peeled her face away like skin to reveal another face, exactly like the soldier looking back, mouthing his private thoughts. And that moment broke discipline. Men ran screaming, some stripping off uniforms, as if the cloth itself had been poisoned. Others wandering naked through the jungle for days. Without firing a single true bullet, Den's force captured 159 weapons, including machine guns and mortars. But the real victory was the contagion of fear the fleeing soldiers carried with them. Stories spread faster than orders, nightmares about backward faces, rifles that became snakes, photographs that changed when you looked away. Command tried to contain it, classifying reports and labeling victims as having acute stress reaction. But the fear fed itself and required no further action from Den's women to persist. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrisburg arrived on January 25, 1960 to investigate and recorded in a private journal, later declassified in 1995, that interviews with 12 men from Puak Heap were consistent in their inconsistency, each describing different horrors, yet the same sensation of reality unspooling. One swore he saw his dead grandfather among the attackers. Another heard backward speech he could somehow understand. A third insisted the rifles were carved from human bone, despite physical evidence showing bamboo in Harrisburg. Concluded these men were not lying, but genuinely convinced they had crossed into a new kind of battlefield, where the enemy attacked perception itself. Something happened to their sense of reality that no psychiatrist could neatly file away. And when investigators tried to piece the Puak Heap assault back together, using standard military logic, it fell apart because the coordination of women emerging from every direction suggested radio nets. But no radios were ever recovered, and the intelligence they had on the soldiers reached into thoughts and private memories that were never written down and known only to the men themselves. By February 2nd, 1960, attempts to reconstruct the attack were labeled impossible. And on February 8th, a retired French colonel who had served in the region in the 1940s went pale when he heard the tactics described and told investigators he had seen smaller versions of the same thing, and called it total psychological warfare, warning that the woman behind it, Nguyen Thi, or Den in some accounts, had studied French interrogation methods and then evolved them into something far more dangerous, a weaponization of consciousness itself. The shockwaves from January 17th spread like cracks through brittle glass, and within days, garrisons across the Mekong Delta reported similar dawn and dusk visitations, always timed to play on poor light and human perception, always synchronized in a way that suggested a hive mind, rather than a group of individuals, yet each incident was customized to prey on the specific fears of its victims. At Bartray, the women stood silent for 7 hours, unblinking and breathing together, so their chests made a slow, monstrous heartbeat, stepping back in perfect unison whenever a soldier approached until the garrison fled. In Gyeong Trom, they sang lullabies that were almost right, but wrong enough to feel like prophecy's soft voices listing the deaths of soldiers, as if reading out a future already written. Den kept moving her command posts across Bentry to avoid capture, but somehow maintained near-perfect control over operations for hundreds of square miles by hiding orders inside traditional folk songs. Tiny shifts in tone and rhythm that sounded like fieldwork to outsiders, but carried complex commands to trained ears. And by March 1960, her long-haired army had swelled toward 5,000 women, organized into autonomous cells, drilled not only in ambush and sabotage, but in what she called consciousness warfare. Training itself was torture turned inside-out weeks. in total darkness to sharpen other senses, learning to move in ways that broke the expected human silhouette and triggered the uncanny valley in anyone who watched, practicing synchronized breathing and mirrored motion so that appearance alone could shred discipline, all designed to leave experiences lodged in a soldier's mind like shrapnel that kept tearing long after the encounter ended. They trained to burrow into the mind, not just the body, learning overlapping speech patterns that made sounds seem to come from impossible directions and borrowing old Vietnamese theater tricks to bend perception. And their most terrifying skill was what Den called memory implantation, where fragments gathered from prisoners and informants were woven into encounters that felt like recovered memories, so that a soldier might suddenly recall seeing one of her operators at his mother's funeral, or remember a woman warning him about his death in a dream. He had long forgotten memories so expertly crafted that even under hypnosis, they could not be told from real events. At first, the American response was denial, official reports blaming jungle fever and combat stress. But behind closed doors, military intelligence went into crisis, and a classified CIA file from April 1960 bluntly noted that the enemy had weaponized the human mind. The United States launched Project Mindbridge in May 1962, pulling together an odd team of military psychiatrists, anthropologists, stage magicians, and Hollywood effects experts to reverse engineer Den's methods. Their reports, heavily redacted when partly released decades later, show astonishment. Den had weaponized culture, exploiting folk beliefs, wartime propaganda, and soldiers' deepest anxieties, mapping cultural pressure points and hitting them with precision. For South Vietnamese soldiers, she used ancestor myths and ghost stories. For Americans, she targeted fears of madness, guilt, and the gap between what the war was supposed to be and what it actually was. One tactic they called reality erosion, tiny, impossible inconsistencies inserted into daily life. So the world felt less and less trustworthy. Rifles mysteriously cleaned, but with altered serial numbers, maps with rivers in the wrong place, photographs that changed when you looked away. What began as pranks turned into paranoia. Captain Dennis Holbrook's unit wrote home about a photo whose eyes were different, a lucky coin with the wrong date, conversations nobody else remembered, and orders that seemed to shift on paper. These small fractures accumulated until training and discipline could no longer hold. The psychological contamination spread like a virus, stories and nightmares leaping from unit to unit, and the more commanders tried to explain it away, the worse it got, because the weapon Den had perfected required no more hands to keep working once it had been implanted into the minds of her enemies. Men began keeping journals to anchor themselves to a shared reality. But even those pages betrayed them, showing entries they could not remember writing and fueling what military psychiatrists called collective dissociative episodes, where entire units shared the same hallucinations, swore by the same false memories, or lost hours with no explanation. Medical exams found no drugs and no obvious trauma, only minds that had stopped recording experience under relentless psychological pressure. In late 1963, Den escalated into what became known as the Children's Campaign, recruiting boys and girls ages 7 to 12 and training them not as fighters, but as innocence weapons actors who could carry out precisely calibrated scenes designed to hook into a soldier's deepest emotional circuits. They played games that began as simple children's play and then slipped in full view of the troops into something grotesque, drawings in the dirt that slowly took on eyes and hands, dolls that spoke in the voice of a soldier's own child, songs that mixed nursery rhymes with detailed descriptions of how that soldier would die. Marine Sergeant Robert McKinnon later described a little girl with a doll dressed like his daughter. A doll that spoke private jokes and then switched to graphic predictions of his death, and the girl never even looked at him as she said it. Investigations showed Den had built a terrifying intelligence apparatus that collected home recordings, photographs from wallets, letters, and scraps of private life. then handed that material to former teachers and psychologists who fashioned personalized torments. The tactic had a second strategic effect. Soldiers conditioned to see Vietnamese children as harmless began to experience protective paralysis, hesitating to act against children who might be planting triggers or gathering intelligence. And those split-second hesitations cost lives in the field. By 1964, American analysts identified psychological kill zones where the sustained application of these techniques rendered units' combat ineffective within days, bringing on insomnia, paranoia, persistent hallucinations, and an erosion of the ability to tell external reality from the inner world. As U.S. involvement surged in 1965, Dinh scaled both the reach and the sophistication of her methods, turning culture, memory, and human tenderness into weapons that could break an army without a single conventional battle. With the arrival of regular U.S. combat units, Dinh faced a new problem because American troops did not share the cultural frame her earlier tactics exploited, so she invented attacks aimed squarely at the American mind. In September 1965, she launched Operation Mirror Mind, a campaign that turned American technological confidence into doubt by planting convincing but fake devices where patrols would find them. Radios that looked more advanced than anything in the U.S. Arsenal medical instruments with mysterious readouts maps with impossible accuracy, all built from captured parts and theatrical props to suggest some unseen foreign advantage. The effect was immediate and corrosive, because soldiers began to ask whether they still held the edge, and rumors about Soviet or Chinese tech spread through units faster than analysis could kill them. Investigators poured resources into examining the devices, only to discover clever mirrors, pressure plates, and battery lights. But by then the seed of paranoia had taken root. Promoted to deputy commander in 1965, Dinh used new resources to create psychological warfare hamlets that looked like ordinary villages, but were staged theaters of disturbance where impossible people appeared, like an old Vietnamese woman who spoke flawless, unaccented English and claimed to be from Ohio, offering details no local could possibly know, and leaving soldiers with nightmares that blurred home and war. Her networks also slipped trained operatives into base support roles as cleaners, cooks, interpreters, and prostitutes whose small, precise acts of sabotage slowly rewired a soldier-esque sense of safety, from arranging personal items to spell words in Vietnamese to slipping recordings and photos into pockets. The result was not spectacular destruction, but slow unraveling units who questioned their maps, their memories, and the reality reflected back at them. And by making the familiar feel foreign, Dinh turned technology, culture, and routine into tools that hollowed out unit cohesion long before any firefight began. They learned to attack the mind where it was most vulnerable. Using tiny acts that added up to madness, a barber would nick a soldier and then mention someone else who bled the same way the day before, sowing a pattern where none existed. Interpreters would mistranslate just enough to turn ally into enemy and breed suspicion. Prostitutes whispered private names in the dark, slipped into the voices of wives and girlfriends, and sometimes seemed to age decades in an instant. A trick of makeup, light, or careful suggestion that left men convinced they had seen their own deaths. By late 1966, Dinh launched what many call her masterpiece Operation Siren Call, aimed at the fragile trust between American troops and their South Vietnamese partners. It began with small, unnerving changes. A cheerful translator turned sullen, a scout making careless navigation errors, a liaison forgetting simple English words. Medical exams found nothing, but Army investigators discovered the truth. Captured South Vietnamese soldiers had been subjected to sensory deprivation hypnosis and a method Dinh called personality fragmentation. Not to turn them into spies, but to make them unreliable mirrors of the men who trusted them. Then came Tet. While textbooks focus on tactics and territory-leaked files show that the psychological groundwork for the January 1968 offensive was laid months earlier with chilling precision. Beginning in September 1967, bases across the country reported shared dreams, visions that unfolded in different camps at the same time among men who had never met. And they were not ordinary nightmares, but detailed prophetic images that would later echo actual events. A celebration that turned into slaughter fireworks, that became gunfire friends who peeled away to reveal death underneath familiar faces that no longer belonged to the men who once trusted them. Private First Class Michael Thornton wrote on December 15, 1967, that he had the dream again, a New Year's scene with paper dragons and laughter that became a dragon mouth of absolute black, from which words in Vietnamese poured like bullets, naming secrets he had buried and spitting out private sins and private hates. And when he woke, 7 others in his barracks had the exact same dream word for word, each hearing their own secrets exposed. As Tet drew near, the dreams grew sharper and more specific, forecasting exact times, locations, betrayals, and wounds until entire units lost cohesion, refusing to hold positions or trust certain men. And Army psychiatrists like Dr. Sarah Blackwood suspected a mix of subsonic tone, pheromones, and visual cues, but admitted this could not fully explain identical visions hundreds of miles apart. Captured documents later revealed Den spent 2 years perfecting collective consciousness. Infiltration, blending meditation practices, conditioned suggestion, and weaponized folklore to seed what she called psychic viruses that spread person to person, gaining detail and terror as they traveled. And in the days before January 30th, 1968, her revelation protocol had trusted South Vietnamese allies, speaking impossible things, naming future events and private details, slipping into perfect American regional accents or the voices of dead comrades, and leaving troops uncertain who they were hearing or whether the next face they trusted might be the one that killed them. On the night of January 29th, silence fell like a physical thing. Not the usual hush of the jungle, but a total absence of noise so complete. Men said they could hear their own blood and the firing of their own neurons, and in that vacuum, whispers in Vietnamese seemed to crawl inside skulls, counting down to some terrible event. When the Tet offensive detonated in the early hours of January 30th, the months of psychological preparation paid off in the worst possible way. Because soldiers who had dreamed the attack for weeks found that foreknowledge only froze them, making every choice feel like a trap set by their own nightmares. And Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, defending the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, later told closed hearings that his men were not fighting Viet Cong, but fighting themselves with Private Anderson, screaming that they had already died and were replaying it, John Williams shooting 2 of his own, because he was sure they were enemy soldiers wearing American faces, and Corporal Davis sitting in the firefight laughing that none of it was real. Throughout the offensive, the greatest wound was the great unmasking. When trusted South Vietnamese allies stood up and recited the manipulations they had carried out for years. A translator at MACV headquarters listing every planted lie and seeded paranoia, then returning to the fight as if nothing had happened, leaving Americans unable to tell ally from enemy or truth from planted fiction, and reports from the field described moments where units swore friend and foe switched roles. Mid-battle, whether actual or mass hallucination remains disputed, while Nguyen Thi Dinh coordinated the psychological campaign from a command bunker that was itself engineered to unnerve a final proof that the war had become a contest over perception as much as territory. Built beneath a Buddhist temple in Ben Tree, the bunker was engineered to unmoor anyone who entered corridors that seemed straight but curved so subtly people walked in circles believing they were moving forward. Rooms with slightly wrong angles that set nerves on edge air, heavy with incense laced with mild psychoactive compounds to increase suggestibility. And subordinates who met Den during Tet swore she seemed to be in two places at once, appearing in a room, then already waiting somewhere else, as if she had slipped through the world. Whether through doubles drugs or masterful manipulation, she cultivated an aura of impossible presence, leaving people unsure which memories were theirs, and on February 2nd, she broadcast the prophecy through hidden speakers in areas thick with American forces, predicting the American withdrawal and the fall of Saigon with such specific dates and details that analysts later wondered whether post-hypnotic suggestions had been planted in key figures. After Tet Nguyen Thi rose to near mythic status, officially reaching the rank of Major General in April 1974. But by then, her real triumph was psychological, not merely territorial, because she had spent years planting seed memories and triggers designed to influence policy long after fighting stopped, and returning veterans carried those seeds home, spreading doubt and strange symptoms that did not fit classic PTSD memories of events that could not have happened. Foreign knowledge drawings of unknown symbols, sudden Vietnamese phrases, and identical accounts shared by men who had never met. Therapists and VA clinicians reported clusters of impossible experiences where veterans across different states described the same woman, the same presence, a figure they called the General who haunted dreams, and surfaced decades later at public gatherings when groups of men would inexplicably fix their gaze on empty air and fall silent for minutes with no memory afterward. A phenomenon captured in footage that showed no person but a slight shimmer in the space they had been staring at, as if Den had not only fought a war of territory, but had rewritten the way an entire generation remembered and perceived reality. When archives finally began to open in the 1990s, the full scope of Den's experiments came into view, and it upended everything experts thought they knew about memory and perception. She had kept meticulous notes coded in a cipher of Vietnamese, French, and math, treating wartime operations like controlled experiments into how malleable human consciousness could be. And those notes show she engineered persistent cognitive anomalies, linked minds across distance, and planted experiences that would lie dormant for years until a trigger flipped them on. One entry, dated March 15, 1969, reads like a manifesto. "The Americans fight bodies and break wills," she wrote. But the real weapon is the mind, and a single infected mind can spread doubt through an entire society long after the last shot is fired. When she died on August 26, 1992, thousands of former operators gathered and revealed techniques too dangerous for official files. Ways to fragment identity, to write false memories so vivid they replace real ones, even methods that seem to reach backward and forward in time. A veteran operator, Madame Tran Thi Han, later told investigators that Den taught them to fight in dimensions the enemy did not even know existed, using tools that only became weapons when aimed at perception itself, and she warned that some soldiers would carry those battles their whole lives, trapped by the very freedom they sought. The Pentagon still keeps a classified file on Nguyen Thi, sealed for decades, and those with limited access call parts of it an ontological hazard, claiming it contains accounts that challenge causality and the basics of human experience. A leaked 2003 memo named the DN effect, reporting strange interactions between exposed veterans and electronics cameras that captured sounds no one had heard, recordings that contained impossible voices, computers that displayed data that had never been entered, and it advised keeping certain veterans away from sensitive equipment and paperless records. Modern military psychiatrists who have studied the material are alarmed not just by the cruelty of the methods, but by their durability. Den did not merely break men, she rewired the channels by which they understood reality, and those rewired channels spread through communities, families, and institutions in ways that therapy and time only partly repaired. Her methods did not merely invent false memories. They revealed that memory itself is a fragile construct, a controlled hallucination that can be hacked and weaponized, and the veterans she broke did not just return damaged bodies, but altered minds that now carried forbidden knowledge about how consciousness could be bent. Dr. Jennifer Crenshaw, who studies what she calls Den syndrome, describes it like this. Imagine someone showing you that every memory, every choice, every life you think you lived is only one of countless possible versions of yourself, all equally vivid, and then forcing you to live those other lives until you cannot tell which life is real. And that is what these men live with. Not classic PTSD, but a multi-reality stress that comes from learning the mind itself is negotiable. Researchers in the decades since have found veterans who share impossible identical memories despite never serving together. Therapists who record patients reciting facts they could not have known, and support groups where men trade the same precise nightmares, and the Pentagon file on Nguyen Thi Dinh, still sealed, reportedly warns that some of her techniques are ontological hazards, dangerous enough that the document ends with a single blunt instruction: do not replicate, do not counter. Forget a command useless to those who carry the seeds of her work inside their own heads. Nguyen Thi Dinh did more than win battles. She demonstrated that reality could be turned into a weapon, that the battlefield could be the architecture of the mind, and that once the rules governing perception are broken, they may never be rebuilt. What really happened in those jungles remains a question that pulls at historians, psychiatrists, and anyone who thinks they understand war. So tell us what you think in the comments, and if this deep dive into the dark side of military history grabbed you. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and share this with someone who thought they knew Vietnam, because the deadliest weapons are sometimes the ones you cannot see, and the doors they open do not always shut behind you.